Welcome. I want to welcome those on Zoom, on Facebook, to our February 23rd panel discussion, History of Voting Rights in America with the Reimagining America Project. I'm Jennifer Roberts. I'm a former mayor, former county commissioner, and have had the honor of working with Reverend Dr. Rodney Sadler for the last 2 years on the Reimagining America Project. We are looking at race in North Carolina and in America and how it has harmed our systems. And Rodney, I'm going to turn it over to you to give your great explanation of how we got to where we are and how we're going to change the world.
Amen. Thank you so much, Mayor Roberts. Again, I'm Reverend Dr. Rodney Sadler. I'm standing here today outside of the doors of the Dexter Avenue Dr. King Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. In part, this is where one of the foci of the voting rights movement was. I'm standing just about a block or so away from the Capitol building, the state Capitol building, which is the place where Dr. King delivered his famous speech at the end of the Selma to Montgomery March. And in essence, this was in part one of the primary reasons for the Voting Rights Act being passed later on in the summer of 1963. As I stand here today, I want to talk about the Reimagining America Project. We are a project that is put together to deal not just with instances of racism, not just with the concerns of the way racism has been manifest, but we want to deal with the fundamental root issue. The fundamental root issue of racism in America is the idea that somehow or another we are divided into different races, that because we're divided into different races, some of us are entitled to greater wealth, power, and privilege than others. Some of us are, in essence, born to serve, while others are, in essence, born to lead. It is this concept that makes it fundamentally impossible to have America. If America is that nation where we hold these truths to be self-evident that all human beings are created equal, how can we at the same time be equal and divided racially, and divided so that some are better and worse than others, and divided so that some have protected rights to vote and others have their right to vote, their franchise perpetually challenged? I'm so happy that we're going to have this not hearing tonight, but this opportunity to hear from some historical witnesses, some experts who will help us understand how did this concept of race influence the way that voting took place in America, in North Carolina, and what's going on with voting today. So I'm pleased to turn over this conversation to Mayor Roberts again. But before I go, I have to say, I want to encourage each and every one of you to join this effort, to join this work. We can overcome the racial disparities that exist in our nation. We can overcome this unfortunate horrid lie of race in America, but we have to do it by working together. So let's promise to come together, let's promise to work together, and let's promise to deliver a better America to our children, our children's children, and to the future of this great nation. God bless you all.
Thanks for that, Dr. Sadler, and that you are certainly in the right place to be welcoming us to this webinar this evening. What a history. We have 3 terrific guests tonight, and with our 3 experts, we are going to cover in an hour. We may go till 6:45, but we are going to cover a brief history of voting rights in America. We're going to talk about the contemporary state of voting rights. You know, what legislation is there? What are the challenges that still exist? And we're going to talk about the history of voting rights in North Carolina specifically, since that is the birthplace of the Reimagining America Project, and it's one of the challenged states in our country when it comes to voting rights and to racist systems and to a history of racial segregation and oppression. So joining me tonight, I'm going to introduce each guest before I ask them a question to start our conversation off and looking at our history. I'll introduce them one at a time, but first I want to tell you all their names and their affiliations. We have with us tonight Dr. Hilary Green with the University of Alabama. We have Professor Claud Craig with the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I will add that Dr. Green also attended Chapel Hill. And finally, we have Mr. Robert Wilson, who has been an Assistant Secretary of State for many years in North Carolina, very close to what goes on with voting procedures, processes, and challenges. So, first, we're going to hear from Dr. Hilary Green. Dr. Hilary Green is the co-program director of the African American Studies program with a partial appointment in American Studies at the University of Alabama. She earned her BA in history with a minor in African Studies and pre-healing arts from Franklin and Marshall College, MA in history from Tufts University, and her PhD from UNC Chapel Hill. Her research and teaching interests include the intersection of race, class, and gender, and African American history, the American Civil War, Reconstruction, Civil War memory, the U.S. South, 19th century America, and the Black Atlantic. Wow, you are really working right in the middle of all the challenges we're facing. So we're going to start with you because I'd love to have you give us a brief overview of the history of voting rights in America. We know that this country did not start with universal suffrage. We know that it has been discriminatory from the beginning, and universal suffrage is a long time in coming. Some think that we're still not there. So I will turn it over to you to give us that brief history. Welcome. We're so glad you're here.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for allowing me to talk about the history of voting rights. And something that I remind my students all the time when we say we, the people of the United States, in order to have a more perfect union. And who were the people? White men of property. And that really talks about how over time different groups expanded the people to include those who were never intended to be included in as voters, as politicians, and the like. And so the history of voting rights really is really nice to look at if you look at the Black experience and Black voters in particular. There's a lot of things that happen to African Americans. You can then trace out other groups over time in which it is something where the state determines really who got vote rather than the federal government. So from the founding of the country to about the 1830s and 40s, Black men in some states could vote. But over the 1830s and 40s, Black men, where property restrictions and property qualifications were removed to enlarge the franchise, they were kept for African American men. In other states, they lost the vote altogether. So we have this large portion, then a shrinkage. It's Reconstruction that we've been really talking about that expansion and what we really think about universal suffrage. And that's where we look at the South, and then where I'm at in the University of Alabama, and I know also include North Carolina in this, because the Reconstruction Acts of 1867 that put the former Confederate states into military districts for the first time expanded the franchise to Black Southern men, because they were registered to vote, to draft new state constitutions, but they can also run for office. So Black Southern men, for the most part, before even Black men in Pennsylvania and others had the right to vote and could vote in the 1868 election. The passage of the 14th Amendment should have given Black men and other minority groups the right to vote, but it doesn't happen. And it's the election violence around the 1868 elections that gets Congress to think about the 15th Amendment. At this time, the 15th Amendment is then again restricted to Black men. Women are not considered in this, and that really causes a frustration and a coalition of people agitating for the right to vote. And in the 15th Amendment is there. This is where violence and the courts start to intervene and whittle away what these rights are. The Supreme Court in the United States versus Reese really in 1876 narrowly construes what even the 15th Amendment applies to for Black men, but it gets a sense of who can vote and who can't, and the role of the courts for either advancing Black political power and rights to franchise and the expansion to others, but also limiting. And it's really where we see the restriction, even those Reconstruction gains whittle down in 1890 to 1908 with the passage of the new state constitutions, but also other legislative acts restricting African-American voting. And in states like mine, I'm in Alabama, the 1901 Constitution, when they were debating the law in Montgomery, right near where the opening of Dexter Church is, where we saw in the opening, Black disenfranchisement and attacks on Black education went hand in hand, because Reconstruction was so successful with Black politicians and very much enfranchised African-American population that brings democracy, small d, across the nation and really expanded the people. And so those Jim Crow constitutions is really where we're getting back to the voter suppression tactics of today, because it's the legacy of those constitutions and the direct and indirect means with the literacy tests, grandfather clauses and the like that we're seeing starting to be put in place. But when you think about it generational wise, it's the grandparents, great grandparents of the people in office today who are going back to the good old days of their white ancestors. And that means certain people can vote, but not everyone. And some of those early challenges, African Americans challenged and got some wins. Gwynn versus United States overturns the constitutionality of the grandfather clause. So the Supreme Court intervenes there. That went too far. But it's not until like 1944, Smith versus Allwright, that gets rid of the all-white primary. So few African Americans who could still keep their vote, they're limited to how they can vote and mobilize their power. To the removal of the poll tax with the 24th Amendment, but also the expansion of the women with the 19th Amendment. So we're starting to see some expansions for some people, but race is going to be very much a key, and who can vote, who can't. Expansion of whiteness and white voter participation is going to increase. And those African Americans and other racial minorities, including Asian Americans, Mexican Americans, and other groups not labeled as white, will be affected too. And the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the hallmark that we think about the classical civil rights movement, is very much key, but also from the beginning, the groundwork to where we are today, it's also laid out in very clear terms by chipping away what is federal protections, trying to say in a state like Alabama and North Carolina, hey, we've done everything, we should no longer be under these federal mandates. So it's not surprising in 2013, Shelby County versus Holder, Shelby County, Alabama. I live in Jefferson County, it's the neighboring county. Alabama, again, able to get a Supreme Court victory, pretty much neutralizing the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And it's that post-Shelby decision world that I think is where we are now. And being in Alabama, voter ID bills, but then Senator Jeff Sessions, before he goes into the administration of the last president, closed down DMVs. And if you're in a majority rural Black Belt community and there's no public transportation, having DMVs closed where you can't get your free ID, some of those same tactics of the civil rights movement had to come in play, where people literally drive people and carpool so people can get an ID to vote. Same thing with closing down polling stations, and majority Black areas, majority minority areas have their polling stations closed, and sometimes hours, so we're seeing the long lines. Again, making it difficult for people to vote. So we don't have literacy tests anymore. We don't have poll taxes anymore, but we have other indirect means building on that legacy of those Jim Crow racial restrictions. We also have gerrymandering and machine-based redistricting. But one of the things that comes back to is narrowing down Black political power, Black and minority liberty power, and these coalitions to push against what was there and the sense of what is universal suffrage. And what other groups have fought for and attained is now being chipped away in a way that we're going back to an era of a not so distant past, but one where I think the civil rights movement and the people still alive and the monuments of King can still help us in the present to draw upon that legacy in order to how to combat this. And that means we need the courts, we need grassroots, but we also need to make sure that we have people go into the polls and making sure they can vote and have their IDs. We can do this if we go from the ground up and in the legal system. and learn from that past. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Green. I know I gave you an impossible task of, 200 years of voting history in 10 minutes, and you did it. So thanks so much. And boy, I have some questions about what you said, but I'm gonna go through each of our presentations, and then we'll have a discussion and some, delving into some more of the items that you mentioned, because there's quite a bit in there. There's quite a bit of history that people who look like me, a lot of white people, are still learning. Things that we didn't hear in school about voter suppression, about uprisings against people of color voting. So thanks so much for that. We are going to bring it a little bit more into the here and now with our next speaker, and that is Dr. Claud Craig, who is the Lyle V. Jones Distinguished Professor of Joint Appointment in African American, and Diaspora Studies at UNC Chapel Hill. Can you tell I'm a graduate? Dr. Craig's research and teaching focus on African American history, U.S. and Southern history, social movements, and the U.S. presidency. He's been featured in media outlets such as NPR, C-SPAN, and his books have been reviewed in the New York Times, Washington Post, the LA Times, and other venues. He recently has completed a book on the Obama presidency and is writing a biography of Marcus Garvey. He learned his BA in African and Afro-American Studies and Political Science from UNC Chapel Hill, his MA in History from University of Michigan at Ann Arbor, and a PhD in History from the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor as well. So, Dr. Craig, I wonder if you can bring us up to the present. We heard a little bit about the Shelby decision in 2013. What have we seen happen in the South since that cutting into the Voting Rights Act occurred with the Supreme Court decision? What was the John Lewis Voting Rights Act all about? Why was it important? And the last part of that is there still a chance that some of those provisions will be brought back up for the Congress to consider? So,
okay, thank you for the invitation and for hosting what I think is a very important and timely session on voting rights, race in America, where the country has been, where it's perhaps going. And much of my job actually was done by the very excellent, eloquent, insightful primer on voting rights that was just offered by my colleague, Professor Green. I think it's the best 10 minutes on voting rights history and a civic lesson on what it means to be American that I've ever heard. So thank you, Professor Green. I would just, more or less as a historian, she's given us the long view, and again, past this prologue, in the 21st century, much of what she laid out is operational now here in the 21st century. At the root of the question of voting rights is the question of what it is to be a citizen. And at the root of that is the question of what it means to be an American. And at the root of that is the question of who belongs and who deserves the rights, privileges, and the immunities of being here in this part of the world, in this country. So voting rights is a stand-in and a signifier for all of those questions. Again, the core question of who belongs, who's a citizen, who should share in the benefits of being a citizen in this country. Voting rights have always been contested, as Professor Green laid out, I think, very thoughtfully. So it's not the case in which the 21st century, history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes, someone once said. So it's not a question that the 21st century is so different from what came before. Actually, I'm struck by the similarities in the attacks on voting rights that are taking place now compared to what we saw during the 20th century and in previous years, the late 19th century as well, the Jim Crow period, in which individual states, much like today, use various machinations, whether literacy tests, poll taxes, grandfather clauses, to more or less shut down the African American vote. So in that way, the 21st century is not all that different. As Professor Green was saying, the pivotal moment in the 21st century is the Supreme Court's rolling back of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 in the Supreme Court's decision in the Shelby County versus Holder decision in I think June of 2013. And what it did, it didn't completely destroy the Voting Rights Act, but it gutted the Voting Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act had required that states get what's called preclearance before they changed anything in their laws in terms of voter eligibility and their electoral practices. The problem had been the Voting Rights Act was addressing the problem of states having all of these machinations and all of these policies in place to limit who could vote, primarily keeping African Americans and others from voting. So the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was saying that these states could not be trusted. They're mostly southern states, but some states elsewhere as well. They could not be trusted to hold fair elections. And the federal government was going to step in and have a supervisory system in which these states could not just up and change their voting policies, their electoral practices without preclearance. And that meant without the Justice Department or some federal court going over whatever change that was being proposed by that state and then giving it a thumbs up or a thumbs down. And by one estimate, there were over 1,000, I think a couple of thousand proposed changes to voting rights policy by various states between 1965, when the Voting Rights Act was put on the books by the Congress, and 2013, when the Voting Rights Act was substantially gutted by the Supreme Court. So like 2,000 different instances in which states were trying to change policies were turned back because of this preclearance clause that required those states to get approval from the federal government or the courts before making a change. So the Shelby decision ends that for the most part with its in the 2013 Supreme Court decision, which opened the floodgates as people predicted. So states immediately and across the board, and not just southern states, immediately started putting on the books, and some states had already done this before, but the Supreme Court more or less said it's okay for them to do it going to the future. Limits on early voting, limits in terms of mail-in ballots, which we're continuing to see. The requirement for voter IDs, which is not a neutral requirement. That is the argument for those in favor of voter IDs will say, well, they're free, you know, if it's free, go get it. Well, anyone has ever been to the DMV, their state's Department of Motor Vehicles, to get a license, a new license, or to get their registration updated or whatever, almost certainly knows what it feels like to wait sometimes hours at the DMV. Often you lose a day of work. If you have children, you'll have to find childcare. If you don't have a vehicle that's readily available, you have to get transportation. None of that's free. So even if it's the case, you can get the voter ID or a citizen ID at the DMV, quote unquote, for free. All of the hoops that you'll have to jump through, you know, transportation, waiting in line, maybe missing a day of work, getting childcare and so forth. None of that is free, and none of that's neutral. So to require citizens to do that makes it demonstrably harder to vote, especially for, you know, those low wealth people who can't afford a day off from work, who can't afford childcare, who perhaps don't have their own car to sit and wait at the DMV, and so forth. But again, the Supreme Court decision in the Shelby versus Holder case in 2013 opens the floodgates for all this sort of thing to happen. This has been put into hyperdrive since certainly 2013, but certainly also since the 2020 November election, in which Joe Biden legitimately became the president of the United States. Several states which had traditionally gone to the Republican candidate, whether it's Georgia, whether it's Arizona, those are sort of the poster kids states for voter suppression policy. But there are many others. have tried to roll back mail-in voting, which escalated during the pandemic. People did not want to risk their lives just to vote. So they took advantage of mail-in provisions in their states. Drop boxes where people could drop their ballots and not have to wait in line, again, in the midst of a pandemic to vote. Those have been, in many cases, in some cases, abolished altogether, or they have been greatly limited in number. Again, early voting has been shown that especially African Americans have taken advantage of early voting. And those days have been reduced by various states as well. And a whole sort of smorgasbord of voter suppression has been introduced by states. And some of the more, I think, problematic policies have been put in place that would allow state legislatures, or have been discussed to allow state legislatures, places like Arizona, it's been considered, and Georgia, to set aside the winner of an election, that vote, and actually for that state to send its own electors to Congress to be tallied as part of the Electoral College's vote for who becomes president. So if you can imagine the voters voting for candidate A to become president, and after recounts and after other ways of confirming the vote, the state decides, well, we don't like candidate A because candidate A is not from our party. So we are going to give the Electoral College votes for our state to candidate B, since we like candidate B and that's our party representative. Although candidate B lost the election, we're going to send our vote to Congress in favor of candidate B. There are actually states that are considering giving themselves the power to overturn legitimate elections in that fashion. So the landscape is an uneven one. That is, there are states that have made it easier to vote since 2020 and even before then. But again, there are states in which the electoral process is in a much more precarious situation, in which they have made it much more difficult to vote. It's much more inconvenient to vote. I think American democracy is also in a difficult space as well, in which we have the loser of the 2020 presidential election never conceding that he lost the election, calling up state officials such as the Georgia State Secretary of State and saying, find me some votes so I can win your state, or say I won your state. The January 6th committee, the House Select Committee that is looking into the insurrection of January 6, 2021, I think will and is discovering a number of troubling things that were happening in the midst of the 2020 presidential election and the aftermath, that suggests that there were these broad conspiracies of folks. For example, they have subpoenaed a number of people who put together false lists of electors, phony lists of electors to be sent to Washington to say that Donald Trump, in this instance, won the election as opposed to the legitimate winner of those states' electoral votes. So again, that's a bad situation for the world's oldest modern democracy to be in, where you have candidates for the highest office in the land not conceding an election, not abiding by tried and true principles, constitutional principles, and so forth. The John Lewis Voting Rights Act has been proposed, has been approved by the House. It is stuck in the Senate. Would not fix all of that. Professor Green mentioned gerrymandering. I throw in there dark money in elections. That is the overabundance of unaccounted for money in our elections, protection for election officials, and so forth. The John Lewis Voting Rights Act would not fix that. It would more or less patch up the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and reintroduce preclearance and make it nationalized, so that states that are trying to make it harder for people to vote, that are getting rid of their drop boxes, that are changing early voting days and so forth, they'd actually have to get approval from either the Justice Department or the District of Columbia's District Court, U.S. District Court, there before they can make those changes. So I think that the John Lewis Voting Rights Act would be very beneficial in terms of restoring the pre-clearance clause of the Voting Rights Act. It won't be enough, though. Again, gerrymandering dwarfs our ability to elect candidates that are truly representative of the population. Dark money in our elections allows for candidates who otherwise would not be competitive to be competitive because they can flood the airways and internet and so forth with ads and things from unaccounted for sources. And the Electoral Count Act needs to be reformed as well. And it was really sorely tested when Donald Trump demanded his Vice President Mike Pence to go in on January 6th and more or less overturn the counting of the Electoral College votes in the Congress. Mike Pence had the good sense not to do that, but the Electoral Vote Count or the Electoral Count Act of 1887 is vague, and that needs to be fixed. I think that the John Lewis Voting Rights Act has very little chance of passing the Senate, largely because of the filibuster policy or mechanism in the Senate that requires a 60 vote threshold for legislation to get through. And even with all of the Democrats voting in favor of that act in the Senate, that's only 50 plus Vice President Kamala Harris should be 51, but they need 60. And there's not been movement to get rid of the filibuster and that requirement, even for voting rights. So I don't see movement unless there are 10 Republicans in the Congress and the Senate that surprise us between now and, let's say, the midterms, when the Congress might even shift hands. There's a good chance that one of the houses will shift hands later this year. I don't see a way forward for the John Lewis Voting Rights Act as it is currently construed. So I don't see a patching up of the Voting Rights Act in the Congress. Maybe some movement on the Electoral Count Act, some clarification there so that you can't have someone telling the vice president that, hey, you can go into the Congress and overturn the electoral count, or for one or two members of the Congress to challenge a whole state's electoral votes, as we saw on January 6th unsuccessfully, but we saw Pennsylvania, I think Arizona, have their votes challenged by a small subset of people in the Congress. So again, a mixed picture in regard to voting rights. I think we're in a dark period, but we've seen many dark periods before, as Dr. Green has mentioned. And this is a piece with that, although I do think we're in a somewhat new place.
Wow. That is, we're going to try to end on a positive note tonight, folks. But resilience, that's the word I like to keep in mind, resilience. And it is terrifying to see a return to some of the suppressive tactics of the past that we thought we had gotten through. We're seeing that on women's rights as well. And what we're doing tonight is helping raise awareness so that citizens can have their voices heard to try to change these things. So thank you for answering that question about the voting rights, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, and then about how the 1965 the Voting Rights Act has been decimated, basically. I'm going to remember that figure, 2,000 attempted laws between 65 and 2013 that were prohibited because of that would have been more discriminatory, and then the floodgates open in 2013. 2,000 laws proposed. Okay, well, on that note, we're going to move to our next speaker, and we're going to bring it home to North Carolina with Robert Wilson. Mr. Wilson served a long and distinguished career in North Carolina state government until retiring in late 2012. From 1992 until 2012, he was Assistant Secretary of State in the Department of the Secretary of State and served as the agency's chief legislative liaison. He also worked with the North Carolina Community College system on the state's Department of Corrections. He earned a reputation for gaining bipartisan support of agency legislation and for advocating greater diversity in state government. We're a diverse state. We need that diversity in state government. He graduated from Florida State University with a degree in history. And he has many, many career honors, among them the Order of the Longleaf Pine, which is North Carolina's highest civilian award. Robert, you have been very close working in the Office of the Secretary of the State, which is, the arbiter in our elections under 3 different secretaries. And you know a lot about the recent history of voting rights in North Carolina. We've been on a roller coaster, and we've seen our district lines change after court decision after court decision. We've seen racial gerrymandering. We've seen voter ID go in and out of the courts. So I wonder if you can bring it home to North Carolina. We've had some news today, but tell us what the challenges to voting rights are in North Carolina in the last couple of decades and then today. Bring it home.
Well, Jennifer, I thank you immensely, and I'm honored to be on the panel with Professor Green and Dr. Craig. I think they've done an outstanding job of telling the story. But before I begin, let me correct something there that you said. I'm a Fayetteville State University FSU grad, not Florida State, because if I could not go back to Fayetteville, and they would run me out of there if they thought that I did not own my university. I'm a HBCU graduate and not a UNC graduate. So, but this is all good. We all do the same thing. But I want to thank you immensely for allowing me to participate. I want to salute you all. And I want to begin by saying that I think we are at a very serious inflection point, not just here in North Carolina, but across the country. For the simple reason that I think that our democracy is at stake. When you have one party that do not believe in the rule of law, and you have another party that's trying to find its way, then you have a mass confusion. Basically, I think we are in what many would consider a civil war. Now, what I mean by that is you don't necessarily have to be in a war with bullets and guns and fighting each other on the street. But the problem that we're confronted with now is we have citizens that are fighting our government. That is, in fact, a civil war. We have been in a civil war, in my opinion, for the last 30 years. And it all started back in 1989, in my opinion, when there was a young Black man, a very astute, very smart, and articulate individual who became the chairman of one of the major parties. That individual was Ron Brown. He became chairman of the Democratic Party on the national level. And he was able to successfully bring about, because we were coming off the heels of a Republican president, and he was able to mastermind and bring into the 90s a young man from Arkansas by the name of Bill Clinton, who became the president. And there has, since that time, there has always been a discussion about the browning of America, not because the numbers were that great, but it was because of 2 individuals, I believe, that made a difference, because they were, for the first time on a national level and on a worldly scale, being viewed as individuals that were sitting at the table. Those 2 individuals was Ron Brown and Vernon Jordan. And they did an outstanding job of representing those ideals and those passions of the minorities. And that became a problem. Then we came into the 2000s when we elected the first Black president of these United States, Barack Obama. Nobody ever thought that we would ever, especially in my generation, ever thought that we would ever live to see a Black president. In fact, many people call William Jefferson Clinton the first Black president. And when Barack Obama became president, it set off a whole new alarm set of bells all across this state and across this country, because there was again a perception that they were coming to take over. And they did not particularly care about that. So we ended up in a situation where the President Obama won not one, but 2 elections. And that really set off the election bell. And we only won the second one because he got about 52% of the vote. Perception then was America has become too diverse. And we need to come up with a mechanism now that we think will be a winning combination. Thus, that set the stage, in my opinion, for that guy to run as president of the United States. And he did some things that I thought from day one was in many ways similar to what I had seen in 1972, when a young man here in North Carolina ran for the US Senate, and he ran on a platform that the guy that he was running against, they said he was not one of us, which meant he was not white, he was Greek. Their end set, in my opinion, was, again, was that set the stage for racism to come into politics and become a winning formula. That same senator went on to run in another election for the Senate. He ran against a very, very popular governor by the name of Jim Hunt. And they did a polling before that race was even legitimately being considered. And it showed that the governor, the sitting governor, would probably get about 80% of the vote, and the US senator, who was the sitting senator, would get about 12%. Well, that ended up in a situation where they played the race card again, where they came about in an election, and I can remember it like it was yesterday. There was a commercial that ran in this state that said, I, Senator so-and-so, opposed the Martin Luther King birthday holiday. Where do you stand, Jim? Knowing that he could not come out and say anything about that, because if he did, it was going to be perceived as racist. Either way, he was going to lose. Then he came back in another race when he ran against a very popular Democrat by the name of Harvey Gantt. And when he ran against him, he pulled out that infamous commercial where they were talking about affirmative action. And he said, well, just when you thought you had that job, he took those white hands, and he put those black hands on top of those white hands, meaning they got the job because of affirmative action, and they are coming after your jobs. That again set off racial bells in the state of North Carolina. And I contend that that type of politics has been a winning formula. And that guy, in my opinion, actually made our senator on steroids, because he played that race card all across the country. And it proved to be a winning formula. So now everybody in that particular party is looking at that as possibly a winning formula. I had a very good friend of mine who ran for the legislature about 2 years ago, and he ran against a young man that had never run for office before. He played the race card against him. He was a Black representative in a rural county, rural area. He played the race card on several occasions. I told him, I said, well, if he gets over 5,000 votes, y'all got a problem. What actually happened was he got 45% of that vote. And this was in a rural area. And I knew then that we really had a serious problem. But I would also want to go back a little bit here and say to you that since our November 2020 election, there have been over 450 bills that have been introduced to try and stop people from voting. They want to cut early voting places. They want to purge voter rolls, limit absentee options, ban the collection of absentee ballots by anyone other than your relatives, being able to throw out ballots that are cast in the wrong precinct. And all of these things are basically based on a huge lie that was given by that guy. But I also want to make sure that people understand that what gerrymandering really is. And it has been done by both parties. Gerrymandering is when people draw districts that will be beneficial for them to win an election and to maintain power. I continue this evening that power and privilege are two things that are basically driving all of this. There are three things that are fundamental in our democracy or in any government whatsoever. And those three things ought to be guarded irregardless. I think many times people don't realize that freedom is not free. It must be fought for and protected from generation to generation. And I would tell you that the three fundamental things that we must fight to protect are, we must fight to protect who gets educated. We must fight to make sure that everybody can vote. And we must fight to make sure that everybody has access to capital. Because with those three fundamentals, then that basically drives any society. And in closing, I would like to leave you with one thought. And it's about power and privilege. People must understand that if your particular group never had to go to the Supreme Court to get your rights, then you have power and privilege. And there's never been but one race in this country that has never had to do that, and that was white males. Thank you.
Wow, Robert, you have really hit the nail on the head with why voting rights matter. Because when you talked about those campaigns and those candidate races and the way that race was used as a dividing issue, that's what it's all about. It's about who has power, who has a voice, who has control over their future. And our systems, our history has been riddled with examples of white people trying to keep that power away from people of color. It is not a pretty history, and we still struggle with it today. Thank you for bringing it home, for giving us the North Carolina history, for making it very clear and relevant to who, in the end, gets to vote in the legislature, who gets to vote in the Congress for things that are supposed to serve all people. And that's what voting rights, that's what those rights are all about. And thank you for bringing it home. I wonder if we could bring all of our panelists now onto the view. We'll have, as I said, we're going to go a little bit past 6:30, and I have some questions for our group because this is such an important topic. And one of the things I want to kind of think through in looking at the way our government operates, what should be the balance of power between states and the federal government when it comes to voting, when it comes to access to the polls? And just to a little bit of background, we do have institutional challenges right now in the way our government works. We have counter majoritarian structures, like the Electoral College. We talked about this, like the US Senate, where we know that, you know, the 2 senators from a 40 million person state, California, have the same 2 votes as 2 senators from Alaska or Wyoming, which has less than 1 million people. Those are counter majoritarian structures. So how do we reconcile states' rights and federal rights when it comes to voting? And I'm going to open it up to whoever wants to go first.
Ms. Green?
I can. I think one of the things the federal government can do and learn from its history, when states can determine who can vote, they're not going to protect and expand to all. So having some protection that if we just enforce the 14th Amendment, that if you are suppressing groups, you're supposed to get limitations on representation, those later amendments of that particular one clauses, and also to return pre-clearances, because states alone in its long history are not capable of doing it. But on the state level and on the federal, on the other side, as I like to tell my family, especially you live in Massachusetts and Northeast, we need to start paying attention to who's in our state legislatures, because they do a lot of things. And so if the federal government's looking at our state legislature and they're supposed to be the representative of the state, they have a lot more power and sway. And this is where those redistricting maps using algorithms to go precisely and breaking up Black power, that same race neutral, which we know it's not. We need to restore that balance, but I think the states alone can't do it because we have authoritarian stance that's translating to the federal, but also to where on the ground, it's not just what happens every 4 years, but what happens every elections from the county commissioners and those legislators to the legislatures to the federal. So I think we need an overall overhaul, but enforce and what are American values and voting rights and who can vote. And our laws are clear on that. So making sure those rights are actually protected and then worked on the ground to reform from it then.
I would say that there are 2 things I think we need to do. Number one, I think we need to understand that legislatures are the ones that make the laws. All right, because there are 3 different branches of government: executive, judicial, and legislative. Legislators make laws, but it is the judicial branch that interpret the constitutionality of those laws and if they are lawful or not. What we're seeing now, especially with the last administration, was the appointment of judges all across the spectrum that will slant that point of view. And that is where I think we're going to lose in terms of our ability to gain. Because you now have judges that, in my opinion, really don't even know much about the law. And they know that they have one intention. That intention is to make sure that I have the echo in the ear of my party and I want to keep it. It's not about the law anymore. It's about who can maintain control. And we must fight that. All right. And another thing that I think that we need to do is we need to understand that freedom, and I keep harping on this, that freedom is not free. Just because you think you can do something today, there is no law that has been made that cannot be appealed. And if you got the right judges, I've always contended for the last 10 years that we are one vote away from losing our freedom.
I would just add to, I think, the very thoughtful comments offered already is that there needs to be a rebalancing of the federal and state power or the exercise of power. And we've seen this rebalancing throughout American history. Professor Green was talking about the Reconstruction period of the 1860s and 1870s. And what happened was states' rights gone amok, and thus civil war over the question of states' rights and whether or not states could allow slavery to exist and expand to the Western territories. The federal government said, no, we're going to put standards down for who's a citizen, who can vote, and so forth that come out of the Reconstruction Amendments. We said in the 1960s with the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, and so forth, states' rights gone amok and saying, we're not going to abide by the Brown decision. We're not going to desegregate. We're not going to let people vote. And the federal government has to step up and say, the United States is not 50 separate nations doing their own thing. It's a single government, and it's under a federal government. And when we have individual states that are out of line with federal policy, the federal government will assert itself on behalf of the greater good. So I think we're in one of those moments in which we see individual states, Georgia, Alabama, Arizona, to the extent North Carolina, doing their own thing and saying that the state says you need an ID, the state says you don't, the state says we're gonna have drop boxes, the state says we're not gonna have drop boxes. It's right for the federal government to step in and say, again, we are the United States, this is the United States and not just 50 separate states doing its own thing. And we're gonna have a unified standard in regard to who's eligible to vote, and perhaps on early voting and what happens in a pandemic and mail-in voting and so forth. And we can't leave this up to the states to do it because they're not. We've seen this movie before, right? they can't be trusted, at least all of them, to do the right thing. And the federal government, if you're going to have a national government, this is the moment. This is the kind of moment a national government steps in and asserts what it means to be a citizen, what it means to be an American, what sort of rights and privileges Americans should have, regardless of what state you find yourself in.
I want to add just one more thing, Jennifer, if I can.
Go ahead.
There is an even bigger monster out there than just voting rights, and that is voting election nullification. We had better pay attention, because it ain't gonna make no difference who casts the vote. If you have a board of election in your county or in your state that now has the authority to nullify a legal vote and declare their own winner because they thought, don't make no difference what nobody else said. They could have said it was the cleanest election in the world. But if they come up and say, well, we had so many people casting votes out of precinct, we think that was wrong, and it was even more than that. So we're going to nullify that vote, and we're going to declare our own winner. Your democracy is gone. So election nullification is that big monster that we need to fight on our local level and on the state level. And pre-clearance, if we have to do a standalone bill in Congress, pre-clearance, not just for southern states, but for all of the states now, need to be done.
Thank you, Robert, for reminding us that it's not just what happens up to Election Day and on Election Day, but also what happens with those ballots after Election Day, and all the certification and all the hands and authorities that get involved as well. Someone told me once that Democrats focus on what happens before the election and the day of, whereas Republicans are focusing on after, because they know that kind of annulment can be the ultimate power. I don't know if that's a good way to divide, but the whole thing, before, during, and after, all of those aspects of voting are incredibly important, and there are loopholes and challenges at every stage to ensure that we have fair and free and universal access. We haven't even gotten into other kinds of voter suppression and exclusion, such as convicts and people in jail who haven't been convicted and their access to the polls. I mean, there's so many other ways. But we have about 15 minutes left, and I want to make sure that we get to something positive. And there was a great question that was asked that was very much in line with what I was going to ask. It came in through Q&A, and that was, how do we educate people to understand what can the average person do? What organizations are out there that are following this closely that can help guide people so that we can all be advocates for our universal voting rights, especially when it concerns people of color who have been discriminated against and left out of power and of having a voice in how they are governed for way too long in way too many ways. What can the average person do? And whoever wants to go first.
I think what Mr. Wilson was saying earlier about education, he gave us 3 pillars, and I like them. There was an economic one in regard to capital, there's another in regard to protecting the vote, and then there's the education piece. And I think the education piece has probably been the one that's been the least paid attention to in regard to civic education. And just coming through school and people knowing that there are 3 branches of government, knowing that there's a Secretary of State of North Carolina, but there's also a U.S. Secretary of State in Washington, D.C., and it's not the same job. Knowing how what gerrymandering is, and how it's an attempt by politicians to pick their voters as opposed to allowing voters to pick their politicians. So I think there's a huge educational opportunity here that needs to start early on in K through 12, so that when people reach voting age, they're one, prepared to vote. I think people need to be prepared to vote not just every 4 years like a lot of us are. A lot of folks are just voting every 4 years in the presidential election. We need to be in the habit of voting every year and a few times a year. We need to be prepared to vote in the primary and in the general election every year. Which is, that's how you get a situation in which our presidential years look different than the off-year elections, whereas, these big swings in which a party does well, and that, every 4 years that we have presidential election, and then that party just falls through the floor in regard to getting out their voters for the midterm elections. And a large part of that has to do with the fact that people are not in the habit, especially working class people, people with low wealth, people that don't have childcare so they can stand in line to vote for a long time, can't get off the job to go vote. So I think that there are ways in which we could have true civics lessons embedded in the curriculum from kindergarten forward, so that people understand it's a complicated system, as we just saw in 2020. Who ever heard of the Electoral Count vote or the Electoral Count Act, or knew what the vice president's role was or was not, or knew what this little official in Michigan could do to overturn, or so I think that there are a lot of pieces, or the Electoral College and how it operates, Ms. Roberts, in ways that are not majoritarian. I don't think that people understand how the Senate operates in ways in which you have a big state like California with 40 million residents with 2 senators, and then Wyoming with about 700,000 with 2 senators. There's no planet on which that's democratic, in which that's majoritarian. So I think if more people knew about how the system operated, I think more people might be outraged about it and want some reform of the system. But I think there's a big educational task that needs to take place. K through 12, the parties need to be on it. The professors, the clergy need to be on it in regard to the educational lift that has to take place. And then there has to be a cultural change. People need to be prepared to go out and vote in off-year elections. They need to be prepared to vote in primaries, in addition to the general election. And again, every year, not just every 4 years. People need to think of every year as a year in which I'm going to vote.
I would add a couple things and what we've been doing, because everyone thought Doug Jones came out blue. No, it was grassroots organizing, going back to that civil rights case and taking people to the polls and educating on how to get a ballot, how to read a ballot, how to get a voter ID so you can vote, where's your polling place. And then more importantly, that primary in which Doug Jones eventually won on a special election, that was mobilization with Emerge Alabama and different coalition groups of women. You have to run for office too. If there's no one running and you only have one person there and it happens to not be your party, you need people to have competitive elections. That was one of the first competitive elections I saw. So even running for school board and different things like that. But the education and the freedom school model of the civil rights movement is something that I have seen in Georgia, Mississippi, and Alabama. LaTosha Brown, Stacey Abrams, that long game, it doesn't end on election day. It just begins there. So you're constantly have a new cohort of voters and getting them in, but also listen to the real world issues. I drive students to the polls because they don't have cars. I'm like, okay, meet you here, pick you up, take you to the poll. I'm sitting in my car with my coffee because I've already voted, and I bring them back. That's the type of thing. I think this is where we have enough elders, people who were in those campaigns, who are still alive. And this is where I think we can do that intergenerational shared community schooling plus K through 12 and everyone. This is all hands on deck, including we need someone to run for office. So I'm not going to volunteer anyone. We need people to run for office.
Well,
Go ahead, Robert.
I would agree with you that and I'm very much hardcore in terms of the value of education, because education to me is the key to basically everything we do. Yeah, and I would tell you that, and having been a history major in college and being a history major at a HBCU, you kind of saw it from a different perspective as it was being taught. And when you look at what the foundation of slavery was built on, almost 240 years of free labor, it was built on three things. It was against the law to educate slaves. It was 60, if you were caught educating a slave, it was 67 lashes. All right. Number two, it was against the law for slaves to vote. And it was against the law to pay slaves. That is how you maintain a system of slavery for 240 plus years. Because without those three things, you cannot function. It is impossible to do in this society. Yeah. And I would tell anybody that education is the key. We have got to go back to the fundamentals. And the fundamentals is reading, writing, and arithmetic. And we have got to learn that. And we have got to make that a fundamental basis for which we are now going to go forward. You can't go forward without the past, because the past is a measuring stick to the future. Without it, you are repeating yourself. And I would tell you this lastly, but history is critical. But understand what history is. History is, in fact, a story of his or her story being told by that individual. That does not necessarily make it fact. It is a story being told. It is amazing to me when I listen to people talk about how history has been a part of our society. And I always tell them, there can be no future without the past, because the past is the measuring stick to the future. So we must understand that history is, in fact, his or her story being told by them. That does not necessarily make it true. That's why we have such a fight today over critical race theory. Critical race theory has never, ever been taught in high school. And in some college, they didn't even teach it. In fact, most schools, it was in law schools. All right. So they took that idea and ran with it and said that it made people feel bad. How in the world could telling a fact make people feel bad? I do not understand. But then to tell that big, humongous lie that we were teaching it in high school and elementary school is even worse. And nobody wanted to say, no, we didn't.
I think I'm going to have to start calling you Professor Wilson. We've gotten lots of history, reading, writing, math, and history this evening. And wow, we certainly have a lot to think about. It is good to know that there are things that the average person can do. There are a lot of organizations. I'm actually working with the Carter Center right now on trying to, lower the temperature around our polarization. A lot of that is racial polarization. It's that group status downgrade that many white people are feeling, that they're feeling like they're losing that power, power they never should have had to that extreme in the first place. But we are having these conversations around how do we bring America back together? How do we recognize that our futures rise and fall together? That we cannot, if anything has shown us that, a pandemic should have shown us that. And yet we remain polarized around basic science of vaccines and wearing of masks. So there are many organizations that are working to bring people back together, to recognize there is more that connects us than that separates us, that the pie is growing. Just because you are gaining in status doesn't mean that I'm losing. It means we're all gaining. And we have organizations like the Carter Center, like the League of Women Voters, like there's a group called You Can Vote in North Carolina that's reaching out to young people. That education you talk about, they go into the high schools, they go into the colleges, they tell people, they actually walk them through what a ballot looks like. How do you go into the voting booth to vote? Make a game out of it, get it exciting, bring it home, make it relevant to their lives and to what they see going on around them in terms of healthcare and the university system. All these things have voting rights have an implication for what's happening around all of us. It touches all of us. There are, other organizations, Democracy NC, which has poll protectors, people watching to make sure folks aren't being intimidated at the polls. So there are a lot of good folks doing a lot of great work. And my hope is that our conversation tonight has encouraged people to be present, to be educated, and to take action. Sign up for some of these mailing lists. Sign up to get information on voting rights, on the new districts we have. So many of these organizations are helping citizens know, has your polling site changed? What can you do about that? How can you help get people to the polls? That is exactly what we need to be doing. So I think Rodney Sadler has joined us again. We've got about 2 minutes left. If any of my panelists want to say one final word, and then I'm going to turn it over to Rodney to close us out for the night. You all have been inspirational, informative, and amazing. So I'll just go around. Dr. Clegg, any final words?
It's been an honor and a pleasure sharing the panel with my co-panelists, Mr. Wilson and Dr. Green, and Mayor Roberts, for your thoughtfulness in regard to being the moderator and putting on the table a lot of really pressing, timely questions for us all to consider who care anything about this country, this democracy, and our fellow human being. So thank you for the invitation. And again, I enjoyed listening to my co-panelists, and I wish you the best in regard to the future programming that's in this series.
Thanks so much. Professor Wilson.
Oh, well, thank you so very much, Dr. Roberts. But I would simply leave you with this, that there comes a time in every generation when a group of people are called upon to preserve their own destiny. Ladies and gentlemen, we are that generation. our democracy, our freedom will not be given back to us by Congress and by legislatures. It will be by people who come together in different coalitions to get out and fight for what they believe in. And those people that get out and fight for what they believe in, truly believe in, will be the difference makers in this country. Many times we have gotten to a point where we really don't even care if we have good candidates or not. The first question we always ask is, can they raise the money? And most of the time, the best candidates can't raise the money because they have spent too much time out trying to make sure that everything went proper in the community. So they didn't have time to make those political connections. I think the biggest thing we can do also is we have got to take big money out of elections. And the way to do that, I think, is we need to go to public financing. And if we do public financing, everybody will be on an equal level. And if a corporation wants to put in some money, they will not be able to give it to that candidate. They will be able to put it in a pool of money that will be dispersed among all of the candidates. So it is critical that we get big money out of elections. All right.
Thank you, Professor Wilson. And Dr. Green is running to her door and come back. You've got final words, Dr. Green.
I am sorry.
No worries.
So one other thing I would say is vote, educate, be in community with people, because you'll be surprised how many people are out here who you might not think, but it's all hands on deck. This is our democracy. This is our nation. We need to fight for it. So thank you.
Absolutely. And no worries about the interruption. We're all on Zoom. We're all getting interrupted by children and dogs and normal life. So again, I thank our panelists so much. I thank our committee with the Reimagining America Project that helped put this together. And Cynthia Perry, Deb Zahn, Samantha Turner have done an amazing job. And there are probably more people on the committee I'm forgetting. But thank you so much for putting this together. And thank you all for spending your time with us tonight. We're inspired. We're a little bit afraid, but we also know we have the power to make change. And I think to close us out, I think I see Dr. Sadler back with us to talk about what's next in our series on voting rights. Dr. Sadler.
Mayor Roberts, it's wonderful to be with you. It's wonderful at all points in time just to hear from you. Such a fine job you did of moderating tonight. I want to say to the committee that has worked tirelessly on this, Deandra, who's with me on this travel seminar, Samantha, thank you so much for your leadership here. For the subcommittee that has worked on this group, that includes the members of the Alliance of Moral Progressives, I really want to say thank you for the way that you have worked to put this together. And Dr. Green, Dr. Craig, Professor Wilson, it is wonderful to hear your brilliance and to hear about you. This is one of the most important concerns. Everything that we're working on at the Reimagining America Project will be impossible if we don't have the ability to vote. If we can't motivate people to change the policies that are reinforcing the racialist paradigm that exists in this nation, we are at a standstill. So we definitely need to make sure that everyone has the opportunity to vote, that their votes are protected, and that the results of those elections are respected. If we can do this, then we can truly bring about the kinds of change that we'd like to see to make America truly the nation it was intended to be. Thank you all so much for all of your participation, all those who have watched both live and on recording. And again, thank you so much for this wonderful program tonight. We have a charge, we've got a challenge. Let's live up to that challenge and make a better country for our children, our grandchildren, and the future of this great nation. God bless you all.